The first questions that the first philosophers asked were directed at the nature of reality itself. Ancient Greek thinkers like Thales, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras wondered what the organizing principle of the world was and came up with a variety of ingenious answers, among them water, fire, and numbers. Their questions were straightforward metaphysical questions, just like those of children who wonder whether a character in a story actually exists, if ghosts are real, or if God knows what they are thinking. Systematic reflection about the nature of reality is at the very foundation of philosophy.
Metaphysics concerns a range of very general questions about the structure of the world. It's not concerned so much with questions about how we get to know what the structure of the world is. That would be roughly epistemology. It's more an inquiry into the structure of the world itself.
Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that attempts to give a comprehensive description of the world at a very basic and abstract level. Ask yourself about the world you live in. What is the nature of a physical object? What kind of changes can a thing undergo and still be the same thing? Are there entities other than physical objects? Do numbers, qualities, ideas, events, or God exist in the same way a table exists? How does a part of a thing relate to the whole? Ask yourself about yourself. What is the essential nature of a person? Are you a physical object? Is there any part of you that is not a physical object? What kind of changes can you undergo and still remain the same person? Are your actions predetermined, or are you truly free? What does it mean to be conscious? Ask yourself about the apparent predictability of the world you inhabit. What does it mean to say that one event causes another? Can something from the present cause events to happen in the past? Do laws of nature exist? If so, where did they come from? Does the universe exist so that you may exist? Why is there something rather than nothing?
A slogan about what metaphysics is would be, metaphysics is the study of what there is in the world and what it's like at a very abstract and broad level of generality. And in particular, addressing those questions that are left over after scientific answers to similar questions have been given.
It is the work of one science to examine being qua being, and the attributes which belong to it qua being. And the same science will examine not only substances, but also their attributes, both those above named and the concepts prior and posterior, genus and species, whole and part, and the others of this sort.
The science that examines being qua being is ontology. The Greeks knew that any theory of the world had to assume the existence of some kinds of entities. For example, if I want to assert that numbers are the organizing principle of the world, I must first believe that numbers exist. The acceptance of certain fundamental presuppositions is known as ontological commitment.
Allegedly, Thales, one of the early Greek philosophers, said that everything was water. I don't know if he could have really meant that, but that's what he's reported to have said. Democritus thought the world was made up out of little particular atoms. Lucretius picked up this idea and had this picture of the world as, they say, everything in the world as involving the motions of atoms in a very regular way, with every once in a while a little swerve in the motions of the atoms. The basic idea behind this was to find the fundamental ontology, the fundamental kinds of things there are, and think of the world, the incredibly complicated world made up out of mountains and clouds and sky and animals and people and plants and so on, as in some way constituted by this fundamental stuff or fundamental kinds of things.
Try to come up with an ontological scheme for the world, so a list of the categories of things, so that everything in the world is going to fit under one of these categories, and the categories are suitably broad. So you don't want to, you could come up with a kind of silly list of categories like, paper clips and everything else. But I mean, so you want a more reasonable list of categories. So you say, there's physical objects. That's one category of thing. Now, is that all? Or there are things that aren't physical objects? Now you're starting with an ontological question. Does the world also contain numbers, or numbers entities, or are they just are they just ideas? Maybe ideas is another category, or maybe ideas are physical objects. They're bits of the brain or something like that.
Two important ontological viewpoints to consider are idealism and materialism. Broadly stated, idealism holds that the mind is the most basic reality, and that ideas constitute the primary organizing principle of the cosmos. Materialism is the view that what exists is entirely composed of or reducible to matter or physical processes. While materialism is the prevailing contemporary view, it is not as simple a perspective as may appear at first glance. Even when you've agreed that everything is composed of matter, you've only just begun to scratch the surface of reality.
In the world, are there just the particles, or is there an addition, a macroscopic thing made up of the particles? You've got a desk there. I think there's a desk there, but some people would argue that there's just little subatomic particles arranged desk-wise, as they put it.
The idealist point of view is epitomized by George Berkeley, an 18th century Irish clergyman who, in stark contrast with the materialists, believed that the external world simply does not exist. Rocks, trees, houses, birds, none of these things are out there. Only persons exist, and their ideas and perceptions of the world are the substance of reality. This astonishing thesis was Berkeley's reaction to the radical skepticism of philosophers like René Descartes, who started from what he considered to be the only unassailable position: I think, therefore I am. In his theory of ideas, also known as the theory of forms or theory of universals, Plato drew a distinction between two worlds: the world of physical objects, which we perceive with our senses, and the world of ideas, which we can grasp only through our intellect. Despite the evidence of our senses, the world of ideas is, in fact, the ultimate reality. Plato held that while individual things, this chair, her desk, myself, may change with time, the idea of chair, desk, and person outlasts all physical objects. Ideas are timeless, coherent, and more real than physical objects. For example, things are good because they participate in the idea of the good. When they pass away, goodness itself does not perish.
Plato's defense tended to be something like this. You've got one white sheet of paper, you've got another white sheet of paper. They've got something in common, whiteness, and so there's an entity, whiteness, that we have to believe in. Or maybe a better example would be we see all these different good things. We call them all good, but none of them are perfectly good. They seem to be, in fact, we never see anything that's perfectly good, but we have this idea of perfect goodness, so there must be this form of perfect goodness that all the different good things are imperfectly imitating.
Is that idea or essence, which in the dialectical process we define as essence of true existence, whether essence of equality, beauty, or anything else, are these essences, I say, liable at times to some degree of change? Or are they, each of them, always what they are, having the same simple, self-existent and unchanging forms, and not admitting of variation at all, or in any way, or at any time?
Plato's theory of ideas gave rise to the problem of universals, whose profound implications permeate philosophy. The notion of universals originated with the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides, who declared, "I have seen many men, but I have never seen man." The issue Parmenides raised is this: what's the difference between an ordinary name for something, this red car, for example, and general names, such as redness? What, if anything, do general names refer to? Is there something held in common by all particular things that are called by a general name?
The problem of universals is the problem of how to understand the phenomenon of sameness in diversity. How should we understand what's going on when we have many distinct things that are all the same in some way? All the ping pong balls that come off a certain assembly line have the same shape, they have the same color, they have the same weight, and so on. And yet they're all different from one another. One very natural way to describe this phenomenon is to say that the many ping pong balls all have something in common. In fact, they have several things in common: their shape, their color, their weight, and so on. But to say that they have things in common is to imply that in addition to the ping pong balls, there are these things that they have in common, namely shape, color, and so on. If there is such a thing as the whiteness that all the ping pong balls have in common, then it's present in each of them. It's multiply located.
The scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages engaged in a furious debate on the nature of universals. The main positions they staked out were realism, nominalism, and conceptualism. If you believe that there is indeed an essence shared by all objects that have a general name in common, then you are a realist. Universals and abstract entities are real. Redness exists. If you hold, like Parmenides did, that the only thing shared by all the instances of a general name is the general name itself, then you are a nominalist. Universals and abstract entities are just names. Redness does not refer to anything real. The middle path between these two views is conceptualism. The position that universals exist not in words or objects, but in the internal mechanisms of the senses. Redness exists in my perception of something that is red. Conceptualism dates to Peter Abelard in the 12th century. Realism to Plato in the 4th century BC. And nominalism to Parmenides himself in the 5th century BC. Nominalism's primary advocate, however, was the 14th century Franciscan philosopher and theologian, William of Ockham.
The nominalist says, look, there's all the different ping pong balls, you bump into them one at a time. The fact that they're all the same color or all the same shape is a matter of they're resembling one another in various ways. And the phenomenon of resemblance, that's just a fact about how the balls stand to one another.
There is nothing external to the soul, for it is as impossible for a thing external to the soul to be universal in any way as for a man, under any circumstance or aspect, to be an ass. Universals are only names. In the individual there is no universal reality different from that which the individual already is.
The question of what actually exists is obviously of great importance to science. Scientific activity is only possible if we accept that there are laws that govern the behavior of the universe. Science must be committed to the existence of such laws, and to a correspondence between phenomena we can see and those we may not have empirical access to.
The question's often raised, what's the distinction between science and metaphysics? And since science deals with facts and observations, what exactly are the tools that are available to the philosopher? But to some extent, the question really depends on a very false picture of things. And I think to see that, it's useful to go back to the time of Isaac Newton, revolutionized physics and gave us something that's much more recognizable as modern science, and in particular modern physics. And it's very striking to see that Newton called himself a natural philosopher. That's what he said he was doing, natural philosophy. And if you ask Newton, he wouldn't say that you can just observe the truths of physics. In fact, you can't. One's access to the physical structure of the world is very indirect and somewhat speculative.
One of the fundamental assumptions of science, and of common sense in general, is that whenever there is a change in the state of the world, something has to have made that change come about. Every effect must have a cause. However, the 17th century Scottish philosopher David Hume argued that there is no irrefutable evidence that causality does indeed exist in the world. The fact that every time I have ever dropped a coin it has fallen down does not prove that the next time it will not fall up instead. According to Hume, reasoning inductively from experience is a habit of mind, not a law of nature.
We talk about laws as doing things. Laws govern the development of events. Laws explain. Laws in some way ground or are connected to causation. And if we were to give a list of what are the things in our world, if we imagine God creating the world, we might ask this question. Well, what does God have to do to create a world like ours? Well, think of God as a fundamental physicist, think of Newtonian physics is right, God has to lay out where all the particles are at time zero, lay out what their velocities are, what their masses are, maybe what some of their other properties are, where they are, and then he has to give the laws.
If causality is brought into question, then the facts that scientists use to support their theories can't be assembled into valid arguments. Without causal inferences, science grinds to a halt. Hume himself acknowledged that even if causality does not exist, in the conduct of our daily lives, we can't help but believe that causes and effects are in fact real.
In order to justify myself, I must distinguish in the imagination betwixt the principles which are permanent, irresistible, and universal, such as the customary transition from causes to effects, and from effects to causes, and the principles which are changeable, weak, and irregular, such as those I have just now taken notice of. The former are the foundation of all our thoughts and actions, so that upon their removal human nature must immediately perish and go to ruin.
Hume's critique of inductive reasoning had a profound impact on the 18th century Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant saw that denying the empirical reality of cause and effect put the very foundations of science at risk. As a result, he took the subjectivity inherent in Hume's view and integrated it into a theory that accepted the unknowability of the world in itself, but identified the fact that we project order and coherence onto our experiences as radically important. For example, while we can't deduce causal connections in the world from our experience, we can deduce that we possess a mental framework for viewing the world as causally connected. These frameworks are shared by everyone, so that even though we can't perceive the world in itself, what Kant called the noumenal, our experience of the phenomenal world is consistent and coherent. The categories of experience make perception of the world possible. By, in effect, turning subjectivity into objectivity, Kant felt he had solved the problem of inductive reasoning. Metaphysics, however, consists of a set of propositions on what lies beyond our experience. Therefore, as reason can't leapfrog beyond the phenomenal to the world in itself, Kant saw metaphysics as being essentially unworkable.
Metaphysics is a dark ocean without shores or lighthouse, strewn with many a philosophic wreck.
Metaphysics came under fire again in the 1920s and 30s as a diverse group of thinkers gathered in Vienna to discuss philosophy. This group came to be known as the Vienna Circle, and they gave birth to a movement called logical positivism, which held that the only kind of meaningful discourse was scientific. Comprehensible statements about the world had to be either empirically verifiable or grounded in logic and mathematics. As a result, the statements of metaphysics were literally meaningless.
The propositions of metaphysics lack theoretical sense completely. They assert nothing. Nevertheless, they are useful to show an emotive attitude in life.
In the early part of the 20th century, the logical positivists argued that most metaphysical discourse is just meaningless. They had a criterion of meaningfulness for statements, sometimes called the verification criterion. So the idea was that a statement is meaningful, cognitively meaningful, in the sense of can either be true or false, if and only if it's verifiable. And they claimed that most metaphysical discourse was unverifiable. And the meaningful parts of metaphysical discourse were really just sort of definitionally true.
Logical positivism had a tremendous impact on 20th century philosophy. And for many years, metaphysics was off the table as an area of serious philosophical study. However, when its premises were followed all the way to their logical conclusions, cracks began to appear in the edifice of their principle of verification. If logical positivists rigorously applied verificationist criteria for meaningfulness to physics, for example, they came up against enormous problems.
If we say that every electron is thus and so, well, how would we directly observe that? It's not like we can look at them all. We might get little glimmers of evidence, but we couldn't directly observe its truth or falsity in any sort of way. And we can't even directly observe electrons, let alone all of them. So once again, it seems that something's really going wrong. Their intention was not to throw out the whole of science, and in trying to throw out metaphysics, they ended up repeatedly finding themselves under pressure to throw out science too, which was not what they wanted.
And they were never able to come up with a formulation of the principle that would sort the right things into the right baskets. They never were able to come up with a principle which put all the metaphysics and the other sort of bad discourse in the one box and the good scientific discourse in the other box.
Another strain of metaphysical thought with its roots in scientific inquiry was the idea of emergent properties, or emergentism. Originally propounded by George Lewis and carried forward by John Stuart Mill, emergentism focused not on whether causes exist per se, but rather on the complexity and irreducibility of their effects. Emergentism tried to make sense of effects that can't be adequately accounted for by their causes. Put crudely, something has emergent properties when those properties are more than the sum of the properties of its parts.
All organized bodies are composed of parts, similar to those composing inorganic nature, and which have even themselves existed in an inorganic state. But the phenomena of life, which results from the juxtaposition of those parts in a certain manner, bear no analogy to any of the effects which would be produced by the action of the component substances considered as mere physical agents.
Well, on the emergentist view, there's reality is really layered. So at the fundamental level, you might have something like elementary particles. The idea is when the elementary particles come into certain sorts of configurations, fundamental new properties then emerge. And so as you get various complex structures of objects, new fundamental properties can emerge, and you get a layered view of reality. You put these particulars together in this sort of combination, you get brand new properties.
In the emergentist view, reality is layered, and the upper layers emerge from and can't be reduced to the lower levels. For example, some contemporary philosophers contend that the phenomenon of consciousness isn't reducible to the firing of neurons in the brain. Instead, consciousness is an emergent characteristic of brain activity. The bewildering complexity of the physical world that captivated emergentists also led philosophers to wonder how to reconcile the scientific view of the world with ordinary human experience. While the data indicate that the universe is defined by Einsteinian relativity and quantum theory, our everyday lives are emphatically Newtonian. The philosopher Wilfrid Sellars claimed that the appropriate project for metaphysics is to bring together the world we encounter with the world as described by science.
The aim of philosophy is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term.
Sellars saw that our experience of commonplace objects, chairs, cars, people, seems at odds with the scientific view that things are wholly composed of molecules, atoms, quarks, and so on. He wondered how we could square our experience of time with relativity, which claims that reality is an intricately woven tapestry of time and space. Sellars wanted to know is the image of the world that our senses perceive, describing the same reality as the scientific image.
So, for example, the manifest image is of a world that has colors. So one of the projects would then be to try to find out how to locate colors in the world as described by science. So are colors, for example, some sort of light property of surfaces? Obviously, the mind-body problem's involved here, because part of the manifest image is the idea of persons who have mental abilities and so on. And what we want to do is to see how to locate those mental abilities within the image of the world that's provided by science. Of course, what's most difficult to do in that case is to show how conscious phenomena fit into the world as described by science.
Figuring out how consciousness fits into the world is one of the seminal challenges of metaphysics. Can consciousness be fully explained by the activity of the brain? Or is the emergent view more accurate, that our conscious life, with all its richness of thought and experience, cannot be accounted for by the mass of neurons in our skulls?
For the metaphysician, consciousness raises the most intriguing kind of challenge into the question whether everything depends in a very strong way on just physics. One picture that has really gripped contemporary metaphysicians is the idea that there really isn't much to the world beyond physics. Fix physics, and you fix the rest. If God laid out the physical carpet of the world, the atoms and electrons, he'll have done everything. You know, if you put the little bits in a certain array, you've done enough to make a chair. If you put the little bits in a certain array, you've done enough to make an economic system. If you've put the little bits in a certain array, you've done enough to make life.
If we are indeed nothing more than a collection of particles, then the operation of our minds is as susceptible to the laws of nature as balls on a billiard table. In other words, our actions are predestined, and our cherished capacity for free will is merely an illusion. Here the metaphysics of mind has obvious and profound implications in ethics and political philosophy. If a person's behavior, or that of a society, is externally determined, how can anyone be held accountable for their actions? Yet the experience of consciousness seems to set us apart in some way from other entities in the natural world.
Seems to be something very fundamental about us, that we're conscious. In Thomas Nagel's lingo, there's something that it's like to be us. You know, if we looked at say this rug or a chair and asked, well, what is it like to be it? People would realize we were deeply confused. There's nothing that it's like to be a chair. I mean, there are things we could say about the chair, but there's nothing that it's like to be it. By contrast, if we feel that there's something that it's like, and it feels like we don't, in my case, I think I know there's something that it's like to be me, and I suspect there's something that it's like to be a cat and a dog. And as we go down the chain of life, we become less and less sure. We're not sure. We're pretty sure there's nothing that it's like to be a stone, that there's nothing that it's like to be a rock.
One of the predominant characteristics of consciousness is our conviction that we're endowed with free will. Yet reconciling free will with an orderly world governed by laws is easier said than done. This project was taken up by the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. A towering intellectual figure from the 17th century, Leibniz adopted the mechanistic perspective of his times, but held that the determinism of Newtonian physics concealed a deeper, more elegant reality. God imbued minds and bodies alike with souls that were perfectly synchronized, like two clocks set to the same time, yet without any causal relationship between them. By claiming the existence of a pre-established harmony between what goes on in our minds and what happens in the external world, Leibniz was able to preserve personal freedom as an aspect of our consciousness. Leibniz's quest for free will led him to investigate the nature of possibility and necessity. Why is there something rather than nothing? Is this the only possible world? Or are there others that play by different rules? Where 2 + 2 = 5? Or gravity repels instead of attracts?
Nothing takes place without a sufficient reason. In other words, nothing occurs for which it would be impossible for someone who has enough knowledge of things to give a reason adequate to determine why the thing is as it is, and not otherwise. This principle having been stated, the first question which we have a right to ask will be, why is there something rather than nothing?
What do we mean when we talk about what must be so, as opposed to what might or might not be so? What do we mean when I play this game with my son, which is trying to elicit his intuitions on what genies could do, what a genie could do and what a genie couldn't do. And kids cotton on very well to this game. They think, well, you know, a genie could make a cat that was 15 feet tall in the air, but not even a genie could make 2 + 2 = 5. Not even a genie could make something that was both true and false at the same time in the same way.
Leibniz concluded that this world is the best of all possible worlds. In his words, the one which is at the same time the simplest in hypotheses and the richest in phenomena. The contemporary American philosopher David Lewis held that claims about possibility and necessity require the real existence of other worlds, a position known as modal realism. Lewis asserted that those supposedly hypothetical worlds are really out there. The world in which Lee Harvey Oswald shot at Kennedy but missed. The world in which Shakespeare decided to stick with acting, and so on. For Lewis, every logically possible world must really exist.
So the idea was that there are infinitely many space-times that are no spatial temporal distance from our space-time, and he explained necessity and possibility in terms of them. So for something to be possible, for it to be possible that there's a human being that's 3 inches tall, there'd have to be a possible world in which there is a human being who's only 3 inches tall.
While his metaphysics was initially met with disbelief, Lewis's views opened new avenues of investigation, and he has been credited with rescuing metaphysics from logical positivism's dungeon. Interestingly, contemporary cosmology has put forth ideas that are closely akin to Lewis's, including the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics and the idea of the multiverse, in which new universes are continually springing into existence with randomly selected values for its physical constants. Were these constants chosen so that life would be possible in our universe, as the so-called anthropic principle would hold? Are we here simply because we happen to live in the universe endowed with the right cosmological constant? Whatever the answer to these questions, metaphysics finds itself once again in the middle of the debate.
You know, one sometimes hears of metaphysics, oh gee, the nature of metaphysics is to raise questions we can't answer. Not so. Maybe some metaphysical questions are like that, but it's hard to say in advance of thinking hard which questions are ones that are destined to forever elude us, and which questions are such that when you think hard about them, you get to see what's going on.